What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, Manny Maradiege, live on July the 12th to close out the week surrounding some more stories in the NFL. We're going to look at a lot of statements, a lot of fascinating statements on a variety of topics that I thought would be interesting to discuss on today's show. Starting off with 49ers tight end George Kittle, talking about how he sees an 18-game regular season playing out and some of his thoughts to improve it or just pitch it as a better idea to some of the other players in the NFL. Then we're going to look at a conversation between Giants general manager Joe Schoen and Saquon Barkley, sort of their last pitch to try to get him to stay in New York, and just my thoughts on it, how that broke out, and just basically that, how they talked to each other, his pitch to Saquon. It was very interesting on that part, and also more on the Giants. A Giants linebacker, Bobby Okereke, talks about the new look that the Giants defense could have in 2024 with a new defensive coordinator coming in. He's expecting big changes, and it should lead to big changes after last year and putting out a poor performance. So those topics and more coming up on today's show. Before I get started, I wanted to remind you guys, if you have any questions or comments, please use the tip and donations link you see on your screen, GSMCPodcast.net. Use that tip and donations link and I'll be able to see your question or comment, and that way I'll read it out loud and get your guys' thoughts on anything I say or on any of the topics. It's a big help for the show and the network as well, so if you would, please use the tip and donations link, GSMCPodcast.net. But that allows me now to move into the first segment, the 18-game regular season. We've heard a lot from a lot of different players, but George Kittle brought up some pretty interesting points on the Rich Eisen show this week that I very much agree with, and it was just interesting to see his perspective on a lot of things. So one of the first things he brought up was just the idea of how inevitable it seems. I've touched on it. It almost seems like if the NFL wants to do something, more often than not, they're going to get their way. They have a lot more power, these owners. If they all come together and they all agree on something, it's most likely going to happen. And that's what George Kittle started off with by saying, number one, it's inevitability. First, going to get 18 games at some point, right? And I think I've said it ever since we got to 17 games. I was like, just give us 2 byes, going off of what Joe Burrow said and what we talked about with Joe Burrow earlier this week. Added that more players would be okay with it if they had 2 byes included in this new plan for 18 games. The biggest thing, obviously, is that rest that players would love to have with another game. It's obviously going to get some backlash. A lot of players are going to speak out about it. But adding that other bye, I think it should prove as a point that players are going to be more easily swayed if they just have more off time. And also, you could look at the idea of adding, maybe in some scenario, pitching out maybe more bye weeks, like 3 or 4. If that could be in a range where that could happen. If you add one, like Joe Burrow said, we'll take the week 13 bye, almost like an all-star break like the NBA has. You have one there and another one that's scheduled some other time for each team. Then maybe you could look to have another one right before the playoffs for all those teams that are having to play all those extra games, having to play those 18 weeks, and then on top of that, the playoffs. You can have a week before the playoff starts, have everybody off for a certain amount of time or longer, and then you can get more into the swing of things. That could be another option, to add sort of 3 bye weeks there for almost the teams that have earned it by making the playoffs. It's just something to think about. Maybe they try to pitch that out there, but I find it a little hard to believe that the NFL will go for 3 bye weeks, but it doesn't hurt to try. They're, of course, going to try and get more of a revenue split, but again, that's also going to be extremely hard, prying that away from the NFL. But George Kittle also talked about, with the addition of the resting your body, getting your bodies right, because 16 games was already hard in his opinion. Then they moved to 17 games, and that was really hard to do. And now 18 games with only 1 bye week is almost impossible to not only have everybody out there, but putting out the best product, which is something I assume the NFL really cares about. Not only putting out more content, but the quality of it has to be up to standards, or else people are not going to get the best impression if these games are ugly or if these games don't have all the biggest stars playing because they're all injured. The NFL wants to try to avoid that, wants to find a balance there. So definitely adding more rest, at least 2 buys, is something I would expect to happen. But more so than that, talking about the offseason changes that could also happen, George Kittle was asked about it, and he gave his thoughts on it as well, on that new potential offseason structure that was posted a while ago back, a few weeks ago now. And he said this, as you guys see on your screen. If you play throughout the entire playoffs, you're playing into mid-February, and you're supposed to show up on April 15th for phase 1 of OTAs. That's pretty aggressive, right? Like, that's not a lot of time for your body to heal, regenerate, to let your mind and your body both rest. And he also added on after that he's pretty much okay with getting rid of OTAs, or just showing up in May, or just having some players show up in May is what I meant. Or just having a 2-week mini camp is something else he threw out just in the month of May for the players that are new. Obviously, they need that transition period to get through it. Adding those guys in, only them to show up, not the veteran guys that don't really have to be there, could be something that the NFL could look into. Or also, if you're just new to a team or something like that, he said you could also show up in May, and that could also be an option to get you more up to speed on things if you're joining a new team, or if you're still relatively new, second year, third year, fourth year guys. That could be very beneficial to them. So I kind of agree with what he said. I really am on the stance that this period is really more so for the new guys. So if there could be something there, at least for the rookies and the new guys, like 4-year players, 3-year players in, that would be the best case scenario for me, because phase 1 through phase 2 or 3, I believe, are all voluntary until you get up until June, like we just finished off with mandatory minicamp. A lot of veteran players just skip out. They feel like they could have a better preparation at home through their own training, through their own gyms, through their own workout routines. So it's voluntary anyway. So if they're not going to show up, they are very much in their right to not show up. But then they get this negative connotation of being away from the team. What is going through their minds by not showing up. Everybody reads more into it when at the end of the day it is voluntary. So it's kind of like a double meaning there. You don't have to be there, but people expect you to be there anyway, and then they almost talk bad about you in some conversations if you don't show up there. Like Micah Parsons missed a lot of times through OTAs, but he wasn't supposed to be there. But again, people really looked into it as to why he didn't show up, why he felt that it wasn't necessary to show up. So that could eliminate it if the NFL does change the offseason structure a little bit, which could be beneficial to some players. George Kittle also talked about being in favor of the ramp-up period that was pitched by the NFLPA, ramping it up a little bit in June, not having the early phase 1, phase 2 voluntary workouts, just having a ramp-up period in middle of July. Then you can get right into training camp without having that long break that we currently are in right now. He was in favor of it, and I was as well. I thought that was something that if you don't really start football until, say, June or early July, like he's mentioning there, and you ramp it up towards the middle of July, I think that's enough time from the last game of the season in February all the way up until June, mid-June or late June, or however they schedule it. That's a good amount of time rather than just 2 months, 2.5 months from February to April when you have to show back up again on April 15th. It's just something to think about for some players. But also in the same breath, it's only 2 teams that play until mid-February. So just to play devil's advocate, it's not the majority. The majority of the league is already home by December or the start of January. So they really have 4 months to get back into the swing of things. It's only 2 teams that really make it to February. So balancing that out a little bit and seeing the benefits and the negatives of that could also just play into that conversation. But also, April to May, it just seems like it is too much overall on my final thoughts on this. Starting back in April is pretty much no time off, and that's a big thing. Obviously, if you're going to add another game and you're already pushing the season back, a week further back, now into February, you're really having no time for these players to rest. So if I were to choose a side, I would agree with George and sort of have it be pushed at least until the end of May, the start of June, before you make it absolutely mandatory for some of these workouts to start. But again, I would love to see the rookies, some of the new guys start probably in early May, April maybe. April probably for the rookies. Or actually scratch that because the draft is in late April. So for the rookies, probably sometime in mid-May, having them go probably from mid-May to June, and then the veterans can start filing in, and then you can get that ramp-up period on your way as well. So that's something to think about with this conversation with the 18-game regular season. But for right now, it is pretty much in the works as of right now. Nothing really being solidified with that. It was interesting because the NFLPA, according to some reports, have been starting to anticipate these talks starting to ramp up in the next few weeks, or at least intensify a lot more at some point throughout the season. So there's been a lot of talk about it, but now some players are getting the inclination that it could start to happen at some point in this season. So I wouldn't be surprised if more of this starts to gain some traction and we get some movement on it some point during the regular season. More people start to talk about it as we go on. But that's what George Kittle thought about it, pretty much on the more positive side of things compared to some of his own teammates and some of the other players that were really against it. But we'll see. We'll see how they come to a compromise. They are still pretty much on the early stages of a new CBA. This is probably going to require them to renegotiate an entire new CBA. So it's going to take a while, but those talks are probably going to start relatively soon. Leave your guys' thoughts on where you stand on the offseason changes and whether or not you like the 18-game regular season idea as well. But with that being said, we will move on with our first break of the show. And when we return, a lot of talk around the New York Giants. First, we're going to take a more in-depth look at that conversation between their general manager, Joe Schoen, and Saquon Barkley that ended up leading him into free agency, and then from that point signs with Philadelphia. What was said and my thoughts on it are coming up right after this break. You're listening to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast.